Hello, everyone. My name is Nikkita Hamar Patterson, and I am a PhD student at the University of Iceland in English. My research is in extreme cinema and different gatekeepers of taste. So, today I would like to share with you my presentation, Gunning for Film Studies, Trigger Warnings, Extreme Cinema, and the Classroom. And this is about my experience this fall teaching extreme cinema in the film studies classroom. So, let's just start. My background is in filmmaking, but the pebble in my shoe that's been bugging me and essentially has brought me to where I am now was early on when I was like the first semester I started taking even film courses. I saw Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. And this was a very haunting experience to me because I obviously found things very disturbing about its use of propaganda. But I was very haunted by how beautiful and how strong of a masterpiece it was as well. And it really made me question what is the responsibility of the artist in terms of what they do, what their art is used for, what she knew she was doing, what she was supporting, what were the opportunities that she had. And it was something I just never could resolve, and I still can't. And I've just always been kind of ruminating on this idea of the responsibility of the artist, but also then what is the responsibility of the audience when dealing with difficult art. So later on, I moved into my MA and I focused on the leveling of horror film, of extreme horror film. I find that these different kinds of titles that are very, very different from each other tend to be categorized in the same little box that people are afraid to engage with. And there's something really interesting about that. So instead of letting society or film snobs kind of push these films down, I tried kind of pulling them up. And now I'm doing my research in extreme cinema on a PhD level, and it's just been a very good time. But I have to say that it's very funny how the reactions to my interests and my studies have changed the further I've gone. And when I was starting and kind of thinking about Leni Riefenstahl and thinking about censorship and my stance against censorship and how that stunts creativity, but how do you deal with material that is dangerous or hurts society? And people thought that was very interesting, and they'd kind of like lean in and ask questions and be very inquisitive. And then the deeper I went into extreme horror and extreme cinema, they're really kind of repulsed and intimidated, and it wasn't met with curiosity often. Mostly people just kind of shut down, like, I don't watch those kinds of films. I cannot watch the kind of films you can watch. And it's a really weird way to end the conversation when what I see now is we definitely need to have a conversation because there's a very clear gap of knowledge. So it was really exciting to be able to take this into the classroom and kind of start small, start with other film students, and let this kind of opening up of Pandora's box kind of pass the torch onto them and see if we can, step by step, get a little more understanding about extreme cinema. So what I really truly believe is that these are not films that are out there to hurt you, despite how antagonistic a director can be in their approach to making a film, or how much of a bully they can be. I still think it's not about trying to hurt you. I think it's about trying to change you. So, my class, it was called Trigger Warning, Extreme Cinema. And I have an excerpt here from the course catalog. It says, from Salo to a Serbian film, this course will focus on the most notorious films subscribed to the extreme cinema phenomenon. So that's true. That's absolutely true. And that's basically how I picked my curriculum. I went to see what will be the films that people are kind of scared to watch and what are the films that maybe they didn't, aren't on their radar. But I continue later. This class aims to analyze extreme cinema beyond its base shock level to consider the social, historical, and political and cinematic contexts of these films that inspire provocative, confrontational, and arguably antagonistic artistic expression. And that's true because that's how we're going to do it, because this title, Trigger Warning, I'm not really using them. That is not my approach to framing them. The thing is, I did not come up with trigger warnings. I was not educated in during the time when trigger warnings were being kind of used and debated in academia. That starts around more like 2014. And it's not something that I seek out. It's not something I use. It's not something that serves me. And therefore, it's not something that is necessarily for me. But I was trying to work around it. So if I was not using trigger warnings individually, why was I using it in my title? So essentially, it was a preventative measure. And I mean that out of respect, because if you are someone that observes trigger warnings and they serve you and you need them, then I respect that. This is not the course for you, not at this time necessarily. If you are one of the people that the debate against trigger warnings, that you've confused trauma and traumatizing content with offensive content, because they are not the same thing. Even though being offended is a valid emotion, it does not equate to a PTSD symptom. So if you're someone that's offended by these films, again, and if you're someone that's offended and you use trigger warnings as a guide to what is offensive, again, this class is just not for you, and that's okay too. But in general, I just wanted to put it out there. It's catchy. It's relevant, it's contextual, it's contemporary. We understand what I mean when I say trigger warning in the title. And if down the line someone were to turn around and be like, hey, this one went too far, I could say, yes, but the name of the course was. So, yes, but there's a playful nature to this too. And I recognize the absurdity of what we're doing. The absurdity of taking some of the most disturbing films and just squishing them into the same course. You know what? I celebrate it because I try to cultivate and nurture a more kind of cult films kind of class culture, that we can celebrate these things and celebrate that we are being pioneers in our institution specifically, that we are engaging, we're going to be brave, and we're going to go into the great unknown. So I want to celebrate that, and I think that's really important to kind of keep things up and moving. So I'm not being disingenuous, I'm not making little of or making fun of trigger warnings, but the concept of the class is quite absurd. And it's quite absurd, as a friend was saying to me the other day, that there are films I can show you, and it's just like pulling the rug out from underneath you. That's wild, and it's wild that I have that power to curate that experience. So I recognize that, I honor that, I respect it, and I hope to help guide people through it. So this is a quote from Gaspar Noé in The Guardian, when he was invited to respond to The Guardian when they were wondering why he hated everything so much to make such a violent film as his first narrative, I Stand Alone. And he says, "I'm happy some people walk out during my film. It makes the ones who stay feel strong. And me too." And I really like pulling this quote out for not just my research, but it was really handy in class, because here we are. Being in the class is staying. And it's not for everyone to be in this class. It's not for everyone to sit through all of Irreversible, and that's okay. But if you stay and it makes you feel strong, that's great. And it's something to celebrate. And guess what? When they feel strong, me too. So here's how I go about things. Like I said, I'm not using trigger warnings, but I'm not avoiding content. I'm being very explicit and forward about content, because we would do our lectures before we do our screenings. And essentially what I'm trying to do when I'm saying let's focus on the context of these things, of the context of these films, I'm using this analogy here and this idea of when you're learning to draw and you're learning to paint. Yeah, you have a subject, and you can see in this frame, I am the subject. But also, I'm a shape, but so is the space around me. So you just see white around me, but that's not like a void. It's still a shape. And when you can start isolating that shape and seeing that me, the positive space, or the film as the positive space, and everything around it, the negative space. The negative space is as important of a shape to draw to really nail what the subject is. So that's what we're doing. We're doing that with going into context. And I mentioned the social, historical, and political context. That's pretty easy. That can help describe some things that can be very traumatic in terms of war and conflict, but also the national context. Where are films coming from? What is the context of this being a French film and the new French extremity trend? Theory and genre, especially like the genre of horror film, like using horror analysis with films that aren't inherently horror films. How does that illuminate the disturbing factors to better understand how the film functions? Auteurism. Why do some directors get to make these things and we accept it? Who decides that? Performance. So we have auteurs, we have directors. What about that persona that they perform? And when they stand behind their work, how do they stand behind it? Are they being offensive? Are they being combative? Are they being intellectual? Are they writing about it? Are they responding to things? Are they performing attitude? It all matters. Essentially, we're looking at paracinema. Paracinema is the negative space. It's everything around the subject that helps define the shape of that subject. And then there's content. How are we dealing with content? Well, I'm looking at excess and how things are contained, because everything in film is contained. Narrative is contained. Visuals are contained. Performance are contained. And in terms of extreme cinema, so is excess. These films don't lose control. They may feel like they do, but they don't. They still function as films. They still function as narratives. So then I ask, when we kind of can isolate how excess is being contained, I ask, where do filmmakers hold back? And here we have a great example. This is from Fat Girl. This image here is a sister witnessing the statutory rape of her older sister, who's 16. She's 12. And we don't watch the rape. We watch her witnessing it. And even more, just another layer of distance, another way to contain the image. She is even containing the image as she witnesses it. So how do we do it? We start big. We start really, really big. But that's the point. All of this is going to be a pretty big start no matter where we go. And I didn't mean to be antagonistic about it, but we started essentially at Solo. We had our week introduction. We kind of eased into things, but then I was not going to let it go. We were going to start with Solo. Solo has been a top, extreme, controversial, notorious film for nearly 50 years. That's incredible. It is also a film that is in reaction to fascism in Italy, both during the World War II, but also in the 1970s. It's a response to Pasolini as an auteur and his previous body of work and the audience surrounding it. It brings up questions about the conspiracies around his murder. What happened? Why was he killed? There's so much to unpack there. It's a great place to start of, let's take a movie you're too scared to watch and let's take all of the information around it so you can still value it. So I'm happy to say, I think in general, while people are pretty horrified by a lot of elements of this film, they understood things about it as well. And then in between, after you see Solo, well, things aren't going to bother you as much, perhaps, not the way you anticipate. So ending with Irreversible, which dedicates every kind of aspect of filmmaking to be absolutely pushing to the extreme, all the way, barely containing itself, but still contained in a functioning film. And they act as like these bookends. So everything in between that happens is always like a distance between, well, we saw Solo way back then, and these are all the things that have happened in between. I think it's a great film, Solo, to compare things to as well when you're kind of stuck somewhere and dealing with, well, I don't know how I feel about this film. I don't understand how it's performing excess. Pull it back to Solo, because Solo really does it best. And so this idea of like screening these films, I mean, it was a pandemic. We were online. How do we do it? Nail those lectures first. Get the readings down first. There's still a buffer of days that we had in our schedule that people can catch up and go read on Wikipedia about the synopsis of the film, about the plot, about details that they feel they need to maybe prepare themselves for and create distance for. There's time. And then on Wednesdays at 1:20, press play. We can't be in the theater together, but we can be technically watching it together. And then we meet and talk. So the challenges of teaching extreme cinema, there's a lot of them. We're coming from different backgrounds, different life experiences. And what that kind of feeds into also is that we don't inherently know what violence looks like. Some people do, but a lot of us don't. And a lot of these films are confronting us with that. We've seen gratuitous violence, we've seen stylistic violence, we've seen celebrated violence, but realistic violence looks different, and that's shocking. Notoriety precedes itself, and I think that's really complicated, but you kind of have to nip that one in the bud, and I did so by not letting out our watch list until I was there to introduce it and why we were going to do things in the order we were doing them. Isolating excess from the offensive, yes. Overcoming taste, yes. What other people think when you're trying to explain something that you're processing and people don't even want to engage with you on this, absolutely, these are all challenges. But the thing that needs to be recognized as a challenge, despite whether you're using trigger warnings or not, is that these films are emotionally invasive because they are designed to be. That's the point. They're here not to hurt you, but to change you. And so during a pandemic, the class itself becomes invasive of the home life. And that is really challenging when it comes to satellite viewings. But at the same time, that worked maybe in our favor because people could create the distance also that maybe they needed to engage with some of this material. I'm not privy to their experiences. I'm not trained to guide them in that sense, but I can support them. And the thing is, 120, when everyone presses play, so do I. I always do. And I kept my promise the whole time. So in the end, film studies, extreme cinema, and trigger warnings. What does trigger warnings have to do with what we did? Well, when I asked my students, like, was this enough of a trigger warning for you? The ones that do support and believe in trigger warnings said, oh yeah, it's enough. We know what we're getting into. But at the same time, I find that really interesting because it's a bit contrasting. We joke week to week. This is not what you expect it to be. And every time I would be introducing a new film, I was just like a broken record. I'd be like, okay, this one's not quite what you expect. And that was the truth of the matter. Every time we saw something new, it's not quite what we expect. So how do we know what we're getting into? We don't. But through the way we frame things, the way we create that negative space in order to understand the shape of the subject, or the way we use paracinema to actually understand the film and how it relates to us as an individual. These things really were what helped us power through things without having to use trigger warnings. Trigger warnings are inconclusive. The issue with them in the academic realm is really hostile because we have students that are arguing for them, we have academics and teachers arguing against them, and the fact of the matter is everyone feels vulnerable about their status. And people are afraid of what they don't know. So things aren't being communicated well enough because the limits have not been defined. We don't really understand what the rules of a trigger warning are. They're not the same for everybody. The approach is not the same for everybody. And if the limits are not defined by either side, pro or con, it probably means you can't define them. So there is no answer. We're stuck in a debate on these things between two parties, two beliefs that aren't ready to be wrong either. And for that, I don't think this debate could be settled. But I think there is definitely ways we can cultivate and nurture and recognize that not everyone is ready for a class like trigger warning, extreme cinema right now. They might not be ready for it tomorrow, and that's okay. But the ones who stay, it's okay they feel strong. And even better, I think it's great that they can go out and push that. While you don't want to engage with this material, you also don't have to be afraid with it. You don't have to watch it, but you don't have to fear it. It's not here to hurt you. It's here to change you. So thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions. Bye.